Tommy is back, and I think at this point you're starting to you're like starting to get close to the range of how many times Ford's been on.
But
You're like a frequent
I haven't beaten
flyer.
the record though yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
I think after this next interview with that I'm going to put out, I think we're at like 9 or 10 at that point. So we got to
Okay.
talk
Yeah.
about. So we got to come up with
I'm trailing a little here. So
trailing. So
yeah.
we'll come up with some more ideas and see if you can rival John. Um,
Nice.
who can out history? Who?
Well, that sounds like a challenge.
All right, it's a challenge I'm enforcing, even though I'm pretty sure no one would really care other than bragging
No.
rights.
No
No,
one
no.
can. No.
If the history was similar, it'd be kind of funny to have the two of you on. Actually, now that I think about it, I wonder if we can do a thing where I can have him bring up old myths that normally would have music accompanied to, and we'll see if while I get him to read or talk about it, you could play the music live.
I think that's funny, but that would create a bit of a technical challenge with the software.
Oh, that'd be a
Some
huge technical challenge.
Sometimes it cuts out such audio. It's like it's designed to filter that stuff out because it considers it's background noise that would interrupt a conversation. So like it'll just be like blank. It'll be silent.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to think that over. Maybe one day we can all meet in one spot.
You have to do it live, like on stage.
Okay.
It'd be the weirdest concert ever.
The weirdest concert of all time. All right,
Yes.
I'm up for it though. You know, never
My
say never. We're gonna make history badass.
God.
Um, and so, speaking of badass, we're going to talk about probably the most badass guitar by one of the most badass companies. And of course, I don't have my Gibson coffee mug on me.
Right. Of course, we're talking about this right here. No?
Yeah,
Is
no,
that not what
no,
we're
that was
saying?
earlier, Tommy. That was earlier. I know
Is
there's
it is it this?
that's a separate
No,
interview. Steve
no,
Vai,
no.
Actually, wait, that's three separate interviews.
Oh, you mean this?
Yes.
This
Now we can
one.
cue in the Stanley Kubrick music. Bum
Yep.
bum. Okay, so the Les Paul guitar, famously named after the man Les Paul, who I think
Yes.
we should do a follow-up interview on him, because he himself didn't just change the instrument as we know it. That guy also has an interesting history in terms of what he did with recording technology. For people who don't know, there are two types of guitars that can be drawn specifically from memory, or two images that come to mind. The Fender Stratocaster, similar to the two guitars that Tommy just showed, and the one we're going to focus on today, the Les Paul itself. It is
Yes.
iconic in so many forms of music. It's like a requirement if you want to be involved with music, period. It
It
is,
has, yeah, it's become it's a legend. I mean, it is far and away the most successful signature model ever made because
yes,
that's what it is,
and
actually.
it is so iconic. My personal guitar is modeled after one
Ah,
by Paul
yes, it
Reed
is.
Smith.
Mm-hmm.
He made his own unique brand, uh, because it's just such a great model overall. And my mom, who lived in New York and New Jersey during the 80s and late 70s, went to Bruce Springsteen's personal guitar maker and Elvis's personal,
Oh,
the guy who worked on Elvis's equipment, Philip Petillo. So if anyone sees the Born to Run cover, the guitar that was made on that was made by Philip. His son to this day, David Petillo, who I know a little bit, who's kept the tradition alive and well and is a very wonderful guy to talk to. Um, Made just an executive decision that he was going to model it after a Les Paul style guitar.
That is hot.
It is. I
That is
wish you were
very hot.
actually here right now to play just it. To show how amazing this model is. I think actually, funny enough, my curse of Tone Quest began with the Les Paul because I was very fascinated with the Allman Brothers and
Hmm.
being aware of guitar tone. Started with looking at Les Pauls specifically.
Yeah, it's impossible to overstate how important and how influential it's been and how much it's touched the lives of so many musicians in different ways. I mean, my own story with Les Pauls actually came later. I had started out playing Strats on tour, and it wasn't until about 2004, 2005. I was like, oh, I'll try one of those Gibson-y things. And I tried one, and I was like, what have I been doing all this time?
Yeah, it's an incredible instrument. Heavy, super heavy. It's probably the most famous of all the single cut style instruments. Um, so let's break it down from the beginning, Tommy. It starts with this guy named Les Paul.
Well, kind of. My favorite part of doing these interviews is dispelling myths and correcting misconceptions. So I think that there is a common misconception that Les Paul invented the electric guitar as we know it, and it became the Les Paul, and that is actually pretty far from the truth. Les Paul did. He was an inventor, as you know. We're going to discuss that when we do a Les Paul episode. And in the late 40s, mid to late 40s, he was working on developing something that was an electric guitar that he referred to as the log, which you've probably heard about. And the log was basically, if you could consider, like if you think of a BC Rich that's neck through and then has the body wings attached to it, well, if you just left the body wings off and you just had the neck going straight on through with pickups and a bridge attached to it, that was effectively what the log was. And he actually brought that to Gibson in the late 40s. Don't ask me the year because I don't know. But in the late 40s, he brought that to Gibson as a prototype and said, would you guys be interested in something like this? And they said, thanks, but no thanks. And that was the last that Gibson and Les Paul spoke for several years until the early 50s. And what actually brought this about was Fender released what we now know as the Telecaster, and it was released initially as the Broadcaster, and they started kicking ass. There was like an electric guitar craze that happened when Fender hit the market with that, and everyone was like, oh, solid body electric guitars, what? Yes, we want that. So Gibson, being a smart business at the time, was like, okay, we need a piece of that action. So one of their in-house guys in 1951 actually started designing what I hold in my hands in front of you. And they're like, hey, that Les Paul guy, he's pretty renowned as being an excellent guitar player. What if we bring him in like to consult on this and we try to make it like it's his official signature model? So they brought him in. He consulted on a couple of things. He insisted that it be gold, and he designed the first bridge and tailpiece and a couple of other aesthetic decisions. And he initially wanted it to, if I recall correctly, he wanted it to be a maple body with a mahogany cap, which proved to be entirely too heavy. So they actually ignored his request and made it mahogany body with a maple cap and a mahogany neck. And they licensed his name and stuck it on the headstock and put it out in 1952. And he didn't love it. He
This
didn't love
this
it.
is a great start. He didn't love
He,
it.
he didn't love it because the tailpiece and bridge that he designed was this funky thing that kind of like went across in like this big, I guess they referred to them as like a trapeze style tailpiece. They came back, and you didn't have like really the best of adjustability. And then Gibson somehow screwed up the neck angle. So when I hold this up flat, the viewers can see that the neck is at a pretty seriously steep angle relative to the surface of the body. If you tilt it so the neck is flat, you can see the body is on an angle. And the first year, the 1952 Les Pauls, that neck angle was way flatter, which made it almost impossible to get good action on the neck. So it played like crap. So they had to work that out. So the next year, they came up with a better tailpiece that was like, oh, I don't have one on display here, but a tailpiece that basically, if you just took the bridge and didn't have a tailpiece, and it just like basically this was a stop bar and it kind of stopped there,
So a
that
wraparound.
oh, kind of a wraparound. Yeah, it was like a primitive version of a wraparound. And that wasn't very popular. And then finally, I believe it was in 54 or 55, they came out with the two-nomatic, which is what stood the course of time. And at that point, Les Paul was all in. You know, he had already premiered it on stage and the whole nine yards, and it was a very happy arrangement between the two of them. So during the course of the 50s, Gibson kept playing with the formula. Now, when it debuted in 52, obviously it had the wacky tailpiece, but it also had P90 pickups. It had the wacky neck angle, and it was only available as a gold top. They didn't actually call it a gold top because it was just the only color, so there was no reason to distinguish from any other model. And then I believe in 54, they came out with the Black Beauty, which is also known as the Les Paul Custom. And that was only available in black and that had triple pickups and all sorts of other special features like adornments, like gold hardware and everything like that. And it wasn't until 1957 that they actually put humbuckers in them. And then the humbuckers were developed over the course of 1955 and 1956 by a man named Seth Lover. So you'll sometimes see people selling humbucker sets that are called like Seth Lovers, and it's a tribute to the guy that created them. And it wasn't until 1957 that the Les Paul got the humbuckers that they're so known for.
So
And
what
then
makes
in,
those humbuckers so uniquely special in comparison to the P90 pickup?
well, the P90 was going to be inherently very noisy because it was like a gigantic single coil. Now, the thing is that you can't expect to get the same tone out of a P90 that you would out of like a Strat single coil because it's a different manufacturing process. But the reason why they came out with the humbucker, I mean, well, it's right in the name, humbucker. The thing about P90s and single coils is they're incredibly noisy, and the louder you play and the closer your proximity to the amp, the more of a problem you're going to have with noise, hum, squealing. When people would crank the amps up to the point where they would start to break up, it would be just chaos of noise. They would pick up all kinds of radio interference in the air, and it was kind of a problem. But one of the things we talked about before in an interview is we see things change based upon how the music industry is changing, how live music is changing. We saw when we talked about Marshalls, how they made Marshalls unholy loud because they had to, because concert PAs were so primitive that all you would be putting into them was the kick and the snare and the vocals, and everything else had to be projecting loud off the stage. Well, you see changes over the course of the 1950s Les Paul run based upon what players needed as bands were evolving, live music was evolving. People wanted higher wattage, they wanted higher volumes, and they needed equipment that was going to be able to survive in those conditions and not be a squealing nightmare. And when they came out with the humbucker, that was an absolute game changer. Now, of course, they couldn't have known at the time how magical the sound of a humbucker is when going into a totally overdriven, cranked up amp, because that comes much later. But it's absolutely magical. It's a nice, happy accident. But then the big thing comes in 1958, and it's what everyone talks about when they think of 50s Les Pauls. And that's when officially in 1958, the Les Paul Standard came out. And that was only available in a sunburst finish, cherry sunburst. And that ran for 3 years, 58 to 59 to 60. So when people talk about 50s Les Pauls, more often than not, they're talking about bursts. Those are the ones that you could, if you had one, you could sell it for $200,000, depending upon its pedigree and its condition. I mean, they are basically unobtainium. and they only made about 1,700 of them.
One of the most sought after, the real holy grail of Les Pauls.
Yes, but it was a disaster. It tanked. It tanked. That's the crazy thing. That's the crazy thing. One of the most iconic guitars has a submodel that is even more iconic and is featured on countless recordings. And you can just name the rock star, and they are either closely associated with a burst or have lusted after one or had one at one point and regret getting rid of it. All the big names: Jeff Beck, Keith Richards. Keith Richards actually was the guy that popularized the Les Paul in a rock and roll context in '60. He was the first to do it in the British rock scene. Jimmy Page. I mean, all these guys are
Jimmy
closely
Page,
associated with 58 to 60 bursts.
yeah, Jimmy Page famously used the Black Beauty, which is what I remodeled my PRS after. Um,
Ah, but
and I
but I'm talking about his number one. His number one is a 1960 burst that he got from Joe Walsh. Did you know that?
I didn't know he bought it from Joe Walsh.
Yes. Joe Walsh found out Jimmy Page did not have a burst, and he had, I guess, two of them or some shit. And he just hounded Jimmy Page's people until he set up a meeting. And he's like, "You got to buy this burst off of me." And Jimmy was like, "All right." And I think it was like $500 or some nonsense amount. And then he went on to use that on subsequent recordings. It's not on the first Led Zeppelin album. That's actually a Telecaster. But starting with Zeppelin 2, he starts using the burst.
Okay, noted. I didn't.
But it was but it was a disaster though. It bombed. It didn't sell worth a shit. And that's why I was quick to point out over the course of 3 years, 58 through 60, they only sold about 1,700. Now we don't know the exact number because Gibson, not only are they not very good with keeping records, but curiously, that one period in time, all of their records are lost, all the logbooks. So they don't actually know the precise number of bursts they made in each one of those 3 years or the exact total. We just know it's about 1,700. And then after 1960, they killed it. They eliminated the Les Paul. It was done. It was over.
But wait, it came back from the
There's
dead at some
more.
point.
Yes. Well, I'm just going on and on. Do you want to jump in on what we talked about so far, or do you want me to just keep prattling on?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it tanked. I didn't know that it did tank. I thought the Les Paul became that standard guitar that they sold. Um,
Well, I mean, the intention behind the Les Paul model was they wanted to compete with Fender, but they wanted to come out with something that was much higher end than Fender. So they took a look at what Leo was doing, and Leo was going with your bolt-on necks and kind of a simple workman-like approach to the aesthetics. And it sold like hotcakes, of course, the Telecaster and the Stratocaster. The thing is, the Les Paul was always intended to be a much higher end model,
it's
higher end. They always Gibson always like, we're like, okay, we're going to compete for the solid body electric market, but ours is a better product and it's going to be priced accordingly. The problem with that is that in the late 50s, the Stratocaster was such a smash runaway hit that they couldn't compete with that. And everyone wanted Stratocasters and not Les Pauls. So countless bursts sat unsold in guitar stores in the late 50s and the early 60s because they just weren't wanted. So after 1960, they're like, well, we had a good run. We'll cancel it. So what they did is they decided, let's come up with a guitar that's more stripped back, has a simpler design, and we've still got Les Paul under contract. So let's not even bother asking him his opinion because he's going to do whatever we tell him. And in 1961, they came out with what you know as the SG, but it was initially called the Les Paul. And for the
yeah,
first couple of years,
Les
yeah, it
Paul
was,
solid guitar. And my favorite debut
yep.
performance of that was the Charlottesville Railroad Show, where Sister Rosetta Tharpe went out in a chi- in a horse carriage in an abandoned railway. It was like 37 degrees out or something like that. pouring rain, and she went out in her high heels and played that like it was nothing.
Yeah, the white one with the triple pickups.
Yep.
I love that.
Didn't it rain, children? Rain, oh yes. Didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know it did, didn't it? Oh, oh yes, how it rained. I said it rained, children. Rain, oh yes. Didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know it did, didn't it? Oh my Lord, how it rained. You know it rained 40 days, rained 40 nights. To make my gum not fit me right. When I get to heaven, gonna put on my robe, walk around in glory, tell the glad news. Look up David in the heat of the day, tune up a harp and begin to play. I know it rained, you know it rained. Oh, how it rained, rained too long.
I love that. But you know who didn't? Les Paul. He hated the SG. He didn't want to play it. He wanted nothing to do with it. So the second his endorsement contract was up, he was like, screw you, I'm out. And that's when it officially became the SG and just the SG.
Oh, okay. I thought it was called the Les Paul solid guitar.
No, no, they changed it. From what I understand, they officially changed it to SG, solid guitar, because they couldn't call it the Les Paul anymore. He didn't re up with them and he hated the guitar.
Damn.
Yeah.
Gibson had like a bad streak in between the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah, it's tricky with them in the 60s because they were really kind of struggling to find their way. I mean, there's any number of guitars they put out that are from the 60s that are still iconic, but nothing that really has stood the test of time the way the Les Paul has. Now, 60s SGs are revered as their own separate thing. And if you talk to SG guys, they'll be like, oh, I've got a 64. That's when they still chimed. In 65, they crunched. And that's a legit quote from somebody I know with a 64 SG. Those words came out of his mouth. And
I
it's
know
like,
exactly what you're talking about.
yep. I was like, okay, I'm not gonna. All right, you do you, man. Once I run it through the kind of amps I play through, everything sounds the same, so it's all right.
Yeah, exactly. You put
But
it in that right level of gain, everything sounds good. Uh,
yep,
okay, so going back to the design a little bit. Uh,
yeah,
so Leo Fender, when he made the Telecaster, he also made the Esquire, which was a single pickup. It had that nice dirty tone to it, a very sandy tone. And I think it was that Fender was winning the guitar sales at that point because they had doo-wop bands and these really sandy sound, beach tone kind of teeny bopper bands that sold and were prolifically popular.
yeah.
Um, and Gibson they did a different direction when they did the Les Paul.
They did. Well, like I said, they were going for that high end market, but I don't really think they actually really captured the market they wanted to go for, or any market really in the 50s. If you look back and you look at any kind of televised performance of some band in the 50s or the 60s, the early 60s, or if you look at random album covers where it'll be like a vocal group and then one of them's holding a guitar, you know, more often than not, if it's not some kind of big semi-hollow body electric, it's going to be a Stratocaster or a Telecaster. I mean, Fender really was killing it, and then the surf music craze came along. That wasn't Gibson's. That was all Strats, and
And
Gibson just really couldn't get a piece of that, and they were really struggling with the solid body electric guitar market, which seems like lunacy, looking back on it from now. It's like, how could Gibson have ever been struggling in the 50s or 60s? Well, they got their asses handed to them by Leo Fender. They just did.
yeah, it was just the right time, the right place for Fender to kick off. Um, and I would want to go into further details as to what other things another time Gibson was attempting to do to compete with Fender. That's how we got guitars like the Explorer, the Firebird, and the
The
Flying
Flying
V.
V. Oh yes,
Yeah, which later on, a guy named Jimi Hendrix would make famous, um,
among other people. Yes.
among other people. Um, but what design and tone are or the elements or what kind of tone was it producing that separated it specifically from Fender?
So what separated it from Fender is what made it eventually so popular with rock musicians. So it is a thick, weighty, heavy instrument, and that very much comes through in the tone. The mahogany body, the mahogany neck, the maple cap adds some bright sweetness to the chunky girth that is the tone. And you'll sometimes see people, you hear people arguing about, oh, with an electric guitar, the only thing that matters is the pickups and the amp. The wood doesn't matter. There's no such thing as tone wood. Bullshit. Everything matters. Everything that's physically bolted to this guitar matters. The kind of tuning pegs you use, the kind of nut you have, everything matters. How solid the connection is between the bridge and the tailpiece and the body, all of that matters. And the Les Paul has this chunky, thick weight to the tone that wasn't really something that was really needed in the 50s. People didn't really latch onto that and say, ah, yes, this is what we've been looking for. But when we start getting into the late 60s and the amps are getting louder and more overdriven, and people are looking for chunky, heavy riff making machines, that's when all of a sudden everyone started flipping out about the Les Pauls from the 50s, particularly the 58 to 60 bursts, because those were just like the creme de la creme. And Gibson took note of that and were like, wait a second. Now all these famous rock musicians are all scouring every guitar store and pawn shop they could find to gobble these things up. And there's pictures of them on like the back of album covers and they're using them on tours. What do we do?
Yeah.
We need to reissue the damn thing. And in 1968, they did.
Okay. Yeah, because there's a lot of it's just incredible guitar players that were coming out in the 60s. Like I mentioned earlier, the Allman Brothers. I mean, they were more of an underground act, but we had, at the time, it wasn't until Eat a Peach came out when they finally went big. But we had other mainstream acts that we were looking at, like Eric Clapton and Cream. Um, Famously, he didn't just go from a Les Paul. Eventually, he switched over to an SG, where he had his famous painted the Fool guitar.
Yep.
And there's a long list of other bands that are escaping my mind. Um, but it's kind of funny because I do recall that there were some acts in the 50s using Les Paul style guitars.
Oh, sure. You're going to find people that use them. And it's not like they sold three of these things a year. People were using them, but they just weren't winning. They were losing out to Leo. More people were playing Stratocasters and Telecasters by the truckload than were playing Les Pauls.
Okay. Wow. That's a total punch right there, right below the belt.
Yeah. No, I mean, like people who are into Les Pauls can't take that kind of thing personally. And like I said, it's not like they sold three per year. It'd be a totally different story if they made several thousand Les Pauls each year and they all sat unsold in cases in warehouses only to be rediscovered 20 years later. That'd be a totally different conversation. They were selling the ones they were making them. It just took a long time to sell them. They weren't able to sell them in the numbers that Fender was moving. It just wasn't happening the way they were hoping.
Well, was there anything that Gibson did in terms of because Les Paul himself was a jazz guy.
Mm-hmm.
Was jazz kind of on its way out? Were there other things aside from the fact that it was just doo-wop that made it not cool? Was it now?
No, I wouldn't say that jazz was necessarily on its way out, but if you look at what a lot of jazz players were using back in the 50s that were playing electric, they were playing hollow or semi-hollow body electrics. that was far more common with the jazz scene. Again, it's not that you're not going to find examples of a jazz player in the 50s or 60s playing Les Paul, but in terms of what was more common, it's not necessarily going to be one of these. So, but think back though, I mean, Gibson consulted with Les Paul. He didn't really design anything that much, and they didn't really sit down with him and make a guitar specifically for him and his needs. They were just like, this guy's popular. He's got records out. He's a great guitar player. Let's stick his name on our headstock. I mean, that's really what it came down to.
Okay.
It could have very easily been that I could be sitting here holding a Chet Atkins for that matter. It could have been any number of guitar players who were hot in the 50s that they stuck the name on the headstock. It just happened to be Les Paul. Now, Les Paul, incredible player, studio innovator, inventor, certainly deserving and worthy of a tribute model to him. But it was almost random, you could argue.
It's almost random. Interesting. I wouldn't suspect that that would be the entirely the reason. Okay. So we're looking at now the invention of signature guitars as
Yeah,
well
pretty much.
with
Yeah.
this. Because beforehand, there was never, you don't really see anybody's name on, other than Chet Atkins with Gretsch. Um, you don't really see anything else with anybody.
Well, no, you don't really. In the 50s, no. In the 60s, not even so much. I mean, the only one that really comes to mind would be the Maserati Ventures models. But the Ventures were selling records by the shipload around the world. So it made sense that you would want to make a Ventures guitar. Um, but the whole artist signature thing wasn't really a thing like it is now. You could say it's basically a craze at this point. And there are some artists that have had so many signature models. It's like, well, what do you actually like and play? None of these are even the same guitar.
Yeah.
Um, but it's interesting to think that, that this came out in 1952 and was a signature model. We're talking that early on in the history of solid body electric guitars, and boom, it's a signature model. And that's why a lot of people don't even seem to realize, I think, that that's what it is. I remember there was actually a hilarious commercial I saw years back. Um, I don't even remember when it ran, but it's some kid in like a guitar store, and he's like playing a guitar, and some old dude comes walking in. He's like, "Nice guitar, can I play it?" And he hands it to him, and the guy just wails through some unbelievably clean runs, hands it back to him. The kid's like, "Whoa, what's your name?" And the guy's like, "It's on your guitar, kid." And it was Les Paul in the ad, you know. But yeah, like I think there's a lot of people that don't even realize that it's a signature model. It's what it is.
Yeah. So now whenever, oh man, now whenever I see whoever's Les Paul signature, I'm just gonna think of it like Inception. It's a signature of a signature.
Yep.
So besides from rock and roll, were there any other contributions or technological advancements that came out from this guitar? Is super to me, it's always been a super experimental guitar.
Well, it was throughout the course of the 50s for sure. And then they got the formula right by the late 50s. The thing is that it's going to sound the way I'm going to answer that question is it's going to sound like I'm hating on the Les Paul, and I'm not, because they were so experimental with it and they kept changing the formula around, trying new things, that sometimes they just straight up got it wrong, even after they'd initially gotten it right. So when they brought the guitar back in 1968, everybody was happy. And then the next year, Gibson got swallowed up by a conglomerate. And then a few years later in 1974, that became under the control of the Norland Company. And now the Gibson was owned by Norland. And Norland kept doing things that screwed around with it. Like they changed the construction of the body from a solid piece of mahogany to multiple pieces of mahogany. And they refer to those unflatteringly as pancake Les Pauls. They kept changing the formula of the pickups. In the 70s, they were no longer the PAFs. Now they were the T-tops. And they just kept screwing around with it. And Gibson has kind of been in a no-win situation for almost the entire history of this model because they kept screwing around with the formula in the 50s, and then they got it right in the late 50s, And literally every change they've tried to implement after then, people have freaked out and said, no, 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 you have to build them like the late 50s. But what's messed up is there's some things that it could actually benefit from. Like you've heard of the infamous Gibson headstock brakes.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of crazy stories about it. Some of my favorite ones are uh, Johnny Winter's stories.
That is the story of almost all the SGs from the 1960s that are still surviving. Almost every single one of them has had the headstock lop off. In fact, this right here, this Les Paul Standard, this just so you know, this is a 1995 Les Paul Standard in beautiful condition. This headstock was broken right off many, many, many years ago, like 2 decades ago. Snapped right off. I challenge you to find where the brake was. It was fixed so expertly you would need a black light to find it. But it is again, it's the infamous Gibson headstock brake, and that is because it's relatively thin at this point at the brake angle. And the reason why this is back on an angle, if you want to talk about innovations that were beneficial, having the headstock back on an angle like this increases the tension at the nut, which increases sustain. But unfortunately, it makes this susceptible to breaking right off if it hits the floor. Now, in the 70s, the Norland Corporation, one of the things they tried to do is they added what's called a volute, where right here, they kind of add additional wood. Well, not add additional wood, they just don't cut as much wood away. So it's kind of like got a little bit of a speed bump here. Now, you'd never feel that with your hands. You're never going to hit it. But what it's there to do is add extra wood there so that you could still have this headstock angle and you get that increased sustain that Les Pauls are known for, but it's not as likely to break if there's an impact. Unfortunately, when they did that, Les Paul fans all freaked out. No, 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 no! You can't change it. You can't change it. So they're like in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation because people have been pointing out since the '60s the flaws in the design. But anytime Gibson would try to do something that would improve it, people give them shit. Another problem is the size of the heel. Now, for anyone out there that's watching and isn't a guitar player, if you have to get up to these upper frets, like you want to do some soloing, let's say you just want to go up there, you want to camp out for a while, just explore the space up there for a while. Well, you've got this huge chunky heel in the way, and that's where the neck is glued into the body. And it makes for a very strong joint, but it's a lot of wood that's in the way. So at one point, Gibson decided, let's make a version that we call the Les Paul Access, where they have this all contoured out and you can get up in there and you no problems reaching everything. Les Paul fans, no, change the formula. Anything they try to do at this point to improve the guitar, they get absolutely just raked over the coals over it. So now they're basically stuck with it's like, okay, we get it. You only want Les Pauls built like we did in either the late 50s or when we brought them back in 68. No changes. That's it. You're happy with the drawbacks. You're happy with the limitations. We can't change anything. Fine. We got the goddamn message. So they never tried this. They never stopped trying to innovate. They just got hosed every time they tried to innovate. Be like, but admittedly, some of the things they did were really stupid. Like they at one point had a model that was the Les Paul Modern or whatever the hell, Les Paul Performance or something, and they had these tuners that were like automatic robot tuners, and
Oh
they
yeah,
just
I think
worked like
they.
crap. Yeah,
I don't know if this is before 2015, but I do remember. What was that specifically in around
I
20?
believe it was right around there, and everyone justifiably lost their shit over that, and they're like, okay, fine. No more robot tuners on the Les Paul. So it hasn't always been good ideas, but that's that when you're trying to innovate, sometimes you throw every idea on the table and sometimes they just suck.
Yeah, yeah. No, I get that. That definitely is not a fun time.
No.
Um, I remember seeing that. I remember playing a couple of those. At that time, I was living in Boston, and I was a regular at the Fenway Guitar Center. because that way I can touch guitars that ranged anywhere from $3,000 to $20,000, and I'd never be able to ever afford any of them, but um, it was a lot of it was a lot of fun though being able to play those, and they had all the Gibson models there, and I'm glad I didn't buy one because I thought it was a great idea at first because at that time I pretty much kept my tuning the same.
Mhm. Yeah, I you dodged that bullet. What I'm trying not to do is I'm trying not to sound like the Les Paul purists that refuse to let them change anything. But the robot tuners were stupid. I do wish that they would actually do something about the neck heel. This is actually ridiculous. Um, I, Ace Frehley from Kiss in the late 70s took his burst and he took like a file and sandpaper and he filed it all the way down to basically like a rounded heel, like kind of like what the Les Paul Access later was. He did that in the late 70s specifically so he can get up there. He recognized the limitations in the design. He was like, well, I'm just going to do something about it. And knowing Ace, he was probably drunk out of his mind when he did it too. Took a chisel and a file that was Les Paul.
A sander,
Yeah.
industrial strength.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, in response to the return and the rising popularity of the Les Paul, did it provoke anything within the guitar industry, within Gibson's competitors?
No, not right away. It didn't because they brought it back because there was demand for it, but it wasn't like there was insane demand for it. They did decent in the 70s, even though a lot of people criticized the direction that the Norland Company took. Pretty much all Gibson products in the 70s, they are really actually for the longest time, people were like, oh, I'm into vintage Gibsons, but not the Norlands. That's when I'm out. You know what I mean? And they're like, oh, don't get a Norland Gibson. They're crap. But of course, now Norland Gibsons from the 70s are worth a fortune too because that's how everything goes. In the 80s, things really dropped off again for the Les Paul because 80s was the rise of metal and shredders and super strats, Kramers, Jacksons, Charvels, the BC Rich super strats in the mid to late 80s. That is what dominated the market. In fact, there was a hot minute for like 1985 to 1986 when Kramer was like the biggest guitar company in the world. And Gibson again is on the sidelines saying, what the fuck? And in 1986, the company got sold again to Henry J. And they're like, okay, we're going to fix everything Norland did wrong. But that coincided with, okay, so now you have to remember here, my knowledge of this is based on just reading up as much as I can over the years. While I was alive in the 80s, I was very young. I was in elementary school when this happened. So I do not have firsthand on the scene knowledge going into guitar stores in the 80s and seeing what's selling and what's not and when that starts to shift. But in the late 80s, all of a sudden, the Les Paul came roaring back in popularity. And people widely attribute that to, you want to guess? You probably know it. The second I say it, you're going to be like, oh,
I'm probably going to be like that, but right now I'm thinking, the only thing I can think of is
Slash. When Guns N' Roses exploded and became the biggest rock band of the late 80s, and everyone's seeing Slash and all the music videos and on tour playing his Les Pauls, boom. Now all of a sudden, people in the metal and hard rock scene were like, okay, maybe Les Pauls again then. Maybe it doesn't have to all be super strats and pointy guitars and everything that's hot pink and sparkly. Maybe now Les Pauls. And that is at the point in time when bursts officially became unattainable for the average musician. The
okay.
58 through 60 bursts. At that point, they were already collectible and already desired, but at that point, it was like, now you can't own one unless you are basically a rock star or just have deep pockets. Now, again, I wasn't there. I wasn't boots on the ground in guitar stores seeing these trends happening in real life. I was in elementary school playing with Legos and crayons. But this is commonly held wisdom is that Slash is the one that repopularized the Les Paul.
Oh yeah, it's the biggest. They were the biggest rock band at the time, and you had music videos like November Rain when he's standing out there heroically in the
Uh-huh.
sunset at
Yep.
the lighthouse. I don't know why it's a lighthouse of all things, but in that music video, it made it really cool.
Yep. Isn't it funny though? What that brings to mind is when you look back on all these kinds of things, how much of rock and roll and metal and all this is following trends. One guy is like really cool and playing a cool guitar, and everybody's like, "Well, now that's what we want."
Yeah, you just don't know. Someone can be like, "Hey, this is how it works," and then one random person comes along with uh like some guitar you'd expect to only see at like a pawn shop or a starter guitar with like a half decent amp, and now they're coming up with all the tones everybody wants. Or you
Well,
have
that's what happened in the '90s
yeah,
because
yeah,
because
that was
then
the era of junk guitars making it big.
yes, just as soon as everyone's like Les Pauls again, then all of a sudden grunge hits, and it's like pawn shop guitars. Now that's
Yeah,
what we want.
pawn shop guitars, things that
And
people
combo
would
amps.
would
Yep.
buy when they were starting, when they wanted to do the garage band days. Then all of a
Yep.
sudden that was the cat's pajamas. Uh,
Yep. But at this point, though, now that we're talking about the '90s, oops, sorry. Now that we're talking about the '90s, now at this point, the Les Paul's not going anywhere. They're not going to discontinue it. It's a firmly established legend, and that's it. It's there to stay. It's going to have strong years. It's going to have less strong years, but it's here to stay, and it just weathers every musical trend from there on out.
oh, definitely. I mean, when I just recently when I had my just, recently I had my pickups redone on my Les Paul looking guitar,
Yeah.
and the pickups after 11 years of abuse got worn out, and I when I went to my friend Jake, he has a thing called fretboard rehab in Rochester, New Hampshire. um, he asked me what kind of tone I was looking for, and I said, well, if you can't make it Les Paul-esque, try to make it sound like a Gibson. And yeah, he was awesome enough to find some DiMarzio-esque pickups that suit my weird tastes.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a heavily sought after thing. Everybody tries to recreate it. People try to uh, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the whole reason I even got turned on to LTD was I was looking for years ago. One of the biggest mistakes of an instrument I sold. I was looking for a nice alternative for a vintage style
Hmm.
Les Paul that I could afford, and someone turned me on to an LTD Eclipse 256. And I don't know, well, I do know the reason. It was a really dumb one as to why I sold it. But I mean, even there's alternative companies out there. There's people who focus heavily on creating their own rendition of it.
Well, because they have the freedom in the marketplace to correct everything that's still wrong with the Les Paul, if you want to use that terminology, without getting absolutely crucified by Les Paul purists. That's Paul Reed Smith. That's the LTD. That's any number of that's Heritage Guitars, which is set up in the old Gibson plant up in Michigan using the old Gibson equipment,
Hmm.
making Les Pauls how they want to make them. I
Yeah,
mean, there's any number of people that are making better Les Pauls, and they can do it, and people appreciate them for it, but Gibson can't.
yeah, yeah,
But you as the guitar buyer, I mean, the world's your oyster. I mean, if you want the Les Paul thing, but you want it to be a Les Paul refined, Les Paul next generation, you can go out and buy one. And Sadly, it's probably going to end up being more affordable than an actual real Gibson because they're kind of overpriced, if you ask me.
They definitely are overpriced. I mean, the market definitely within the last five years has skyrocketed. Um, but yeah, Gibson's always going to be that company that costs more. They've got the brand name, um, and it's
Yeah.
not
Now,
like
to their defense, the Les Pauls they've been making since around, I want to say 2019, 2020, when they had a change in management and they just kind of went through and cleaned house and were like, we need to get our shit together. They have been making the best Les Pauls they have in years,
yeah,
these last couple years. If you,
I was
yeah,
gonna say they've stepped their game up. It's expensive, but they definitely at this point I'm gonna argue, these are good years ahead of them. Where beforehand, uh, definitely their last CEO or management they started to tank. Um,
that was Henry J. That's the guy that took it over in 1986 with the intention of turning the company around and cleaning up New Orleans mess. And then he basically, I guess this is kind of paraphrasing something from what was it, Batman? That you stay in it long enough until you become the villain or some shit like that. Was that a Harvey
yeah,
Dent quote? Yeah,
yeah, you
you live
live.
long enough to see yourself become the villain or
That
something
could
like that.
be. I'm not, that I think that's the last line in Shutter Island.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah, he asked him. He's like, Do you want to die? Do you want to die knowing you're a hero, or see yourself live long enough to be a villain?"
There you go.
He
Well, that's
says it
basically
intentionally. So yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio
yeah.
does intentionally to go get lobotomized.
That's
Um,
basically what happened with Henry J. I mean, he held control of the company for decades, and eventually everyone's like, Henry J sucks. He's ruining Gibson. It's like, well, when he came in, he was like, you're a Gibson savior. What are you going to do?
yeah, what are you gonna do? You never know what'll happen. Somebody could start out, top of their game, and then turn into the complete opposite of what they were initially. Um,
I mean, where we're at now with Gibson is we've been there before. This one is a 95, as I mentioned, and the mid 90s Les Paul standards are considered to be some of the best ones they ever made. And then it wasn't much longer after that that everyone's, got pitchforks and torches outside Henry J's door. You're ruining our
yeah.
company. You're ruining Gus Paul's. You're ruining Gibson, and it's up and down, up and down. But yeah, you're right. For a hot minute there, I was like wondering. I was like, is somebody else just going to come in and buy Gibson up at this point? Like, is
Yeah.
that what's going to happen now? Are they going to get bought up? But much to my surprise, they've ended up buying up other companies. Gibson bought Mesa Boogie,
Yeah.
which is crazy. So they're doing good.
Yeah, they are. So far they're doing a great job, and what they're producing has been quality, and I'm glad
Yeah.
because it's a great name that's made a lot of changes. Obviously, you and I are going to be doing more videos on them because Gibson rocks.
We can do Explorer, we can do V, we can do all that stuff.
Yep, we sure can. So, definitely we'll look forward to more on this in the remainder of 2025.
Absolutely.
Give anything else you want to close out for today, Tommy?
Yes, I have some important words of wisdom. If you have one of these, bridge pickup, volume on 10, tone on 10, forget about the neck, right into a Marshall. You'll thank me later.
Full speed. All right. Thank you again, Tommy.
You got that.